Let's get to the lesson this evening. I'm going to do the third in a series now on Sunday evenings on reading the Bible through. It doesn't take a miracle for you to understand the Bible. The Bible doesn't have to change. You can read it just like it is. And you don't have to change. It doesn't take a miracle, something supernatural, for you to be able to see something that isn't there. What you need to do is read it. And I know the Bible can be difficult to read sometimes, but I'm thinking here as I do this lesson, if we kind of know what to expect when we get into it, maybe it'll be easier to read. If you haven't read Genesis, sit down and read those 50 chapters. It's that story from the beginning, and then it carries you through that family for 4 generations. And understand that's what leads up to Exodus, the second book. So much of the early portion of the Bible is a story. It's narrative, and it's really fun and easy to read. And when we come to the book of Exodus, we're going to be reading about the birth of a nation. That started off with those 12 sons. If you took at Exodus chapter 1 and you start reading immediately, you're going to read the names of those 12 sons of Israel, 12 sons of Jacob. It's the sons of Jacob and their families that become the 12 tribes of Israel. And they come over from the land of Canaan into Egypt, and with them and their families and their servants, they bring about 70 souls. Now that sounds like a big family, but that is a small nation. About 70 souls into Egypt. And sometime I have said it this way, it's as though the Lord put this large family here, and He's going to turn them into a nation. And I guess I like the way it sounds, in the incubator of Egypt. You know what an incubator is? Well, you take the eggs and you put them in where they'll be safe and in a controlled environment, and you take care of them there until they're ready to be hatched out of that egg. Well, it's like Israel, this little family, put them in the incubator of Egypt. They are away from the influences of Canaan, and that was beginning to infiltrate that family and corrupt them. Take them away from that by distance, and they're away from the Egyptians too. Even though they're in the land of Egypt, there is a cultural divide between those sons of Israel and the Egyptians that just kept them separate. And as they are separate, they're going to grow into a great nation. While we read in the book of Exodus, chapter 1 and verse 7. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. What else can you say? They grew and grew and grew and grew. It was a healthy environment for them. But not only that, the Egyptians, they grew so large, the Egyptians became afraid of them. And so they begin to oppress them and turn them into servants and into slaves, hoping that by hard oppression they could keep them down. But then it says in Exodus 1:9, the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. Well, Pharaoh said, this is what we're going to have to do. We have to kill their children. We're going to zero in on their boys. We will kill their sons when they are born. And this one mother had her little baby. He was so beautiful. She had a plan. I'm going to hide him. Now, how do you hide a little infant when they're out to kill him? Well, she took him and put him in a basket that would float and hid him among the bulrushes. And his older sister was watching out for him. And Pharaoh's daughter comes down to the river to bathe herself, and she looks and she sees that basket, and she sends one of her servants, go fetch that basket. And they bring that servant, that servant brings that basket to her, and she opens that basket, and there's this little baby boy. And God had made Moses a beautiful baby. I would just love to have seen that little baby. When she opened that basket, this young daughter of Pharaoh opened it, looking at this beautiful little baby boy. And she knew what was up. She said, I'm going to keep this child. And Miriam, that sister, brave little Miriam, she runs right up and says, I know where I can get a nurse for him. Surely Pharaoh's daughter must have known what this was about. It doesn't say that, but how could you not kind of figure what's going on here? Moses' own mother became his nurse in the house of Pharaoh. Can't you see God's providence working in this? And so she said, I'm going to call him Moses because I drew him out of the water. And then for 40 years, Moses grew in the house of Pharaoh. They would teach him all the learning of the Egyptians as he was growing up. And he was an important man and a leader among men in the house of Pharaoh. And one day when he was 40 years old, he saw a Jew and an Egyptian in a fight. And he intervened. You see, Moses, he knew that he was of Israel. That's what he knew. And so with this Israelite and this Egyptian in a fight, he intervened and he killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. But word got out that he had done this, and he was afraid. And so he fled into the wilderness. And for 40 years, he lived in the wilderness as a shepherd, looking after sheep. He married out there, looked after his father-in-law's sheep in the wilderness. It's as though for 40 years, God had Moses in a position where he could learn to be the leader of men. And then for 40 years, he had him out in the wilderness where he would learn the humility to be a follower of God. He's out on the backside of the desert one day, and he sees a bush that is burning. And he watches, and it doesn't burn up. He approaches the bush to see what this thing is. And as he approaches, a voice comes out of that bush. Moses, take off your shoes. The ground on which you stand is holy. Well, Moses took his shoes off to that bush, and that voice said, I am the Lord God of your fathers. Now you go back and you tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Moses did not want to do this. He tried to come up with excuses. It's almost ironic. You know, when you read the Bible, it was very eloquent. The way Moses said, I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. I mean, what a eloquent way to say that you're not eloquent enough to do this. So that wasn't going to work. God said, I'm going to send Aaron to you. And he will be like to you a prophet, and he will speak for you. But now you do what I say, and I will be with you. And gave him signs to perform. Moses goes before Pharaoh and delivers God's message. The Lord God of Israel saith, let my people go. And then in Exodus chapter 5 and verse 2, Pharaoh said, who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. Well, Pharaoh was going to find out who the Lord was. 9 plagues come on the land, one right after another. Very hard, serious blows to that nation. Well, Pharaoh held out. He would not relent. He would not let those people go. One more plague was going to come, and it was going to crack that hard heart of his. He's going to take the firstborn out of every household of Egypt. But the instruction was to the Israelites, here's how to escape that plague. You go get a lamb. You slay the lamb, and you take the blood of that lamb, and you put it over your door. Why, you can see those bloody marks over the doors of their houses. That would be ominous, wouldn't it? Now you go in that house and you stay there. And you take that lamb and you roast it. You eat all of that lamb that you can eat. If there's anything left over, burn it. There's to be nothing remaining in the morning. You eat that lamb with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. You're not going to have time for the bread to rise. Get rid of that leaven in your house. Make unleavened bread, bitter herbs, roasted lamb. And in the morning, you're going to walk out of Egypt. And sure enough, the next day, Pharaoh said, get them out of here. And the Egyptians were so glad to see them go. They loaded them down with gifts just to get them out of here. They did not want any more of these plagues. And they march off as a great nation. And they come to the Red Sea. And now they're up against the sea. And that old Pharaoh, after all he'd been through, that heart hardened up again. And he says, I'm going after them. And he got his armies, and the children of Israel look up, and here comes Pharaoh and his armies. And if they didn't turn on Moses, you brought us out here for us to die at the hand of Pharaoh. God intervened with a great pillar of fire that came down, and it was between the armies of Pharaoh and this young nation of Israel. And while Pharaoh was held out by that pillar of fire, he told Moses, stretch forth thy rod over the sea. And Moses stretched his rod out over the sea, and a great wind blew, and the waters congealed in the depths of the sea. And a path opened up, a path of dry land right across the sea. And they marched across the sea on dry land. They got to the other side, and that pillar of fire left. Pharaoh told his army, go after them. And they go charging down into that Dead Sea, that Red Sea, and they get out in the middle of this, and the waters come back over, and it destroys the armies of Pharaoh. And the children of Israel on the other side, they are rejoicing. Praise to the Lord. He hath triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he hath thrown into the sea. Then on the far side of that sea now, this new nation of their freedom, they begin marching out into the middle of the desert. Out there where Moses had seen that burning bush. Going down to Mount Sinai. They got thirsty and complained about not having water, and God gave them water from a rock. They said, well, we don't have the food. You know, I'm just amazed. Here they were. They didn't have food. God fed them manna. I mean, it's the food of angels, manna from heaven. And they went further, and they were complaining. You know what they're complaining about? It's just unthinkable. They said, we don't have any onions. They missed the leeks and the onions from Egypt, of all things. And they didn't have meat. God sent them quail so they could have meat. God was providing them everything they needed. And they came to the foot of Mount Sinai. And while they were there at the foot of Mount Sinai, that voice that Moses heard from that bush was now up on that mountain. And there was thunders and lightnings and the earthquake. And the voice from that mountain spake to them and gave them the 10 commandments. And it scared them. They said, don't let God talk to us like that. We will stay here. Moses, you go up in that mountain and you come back and tell us what he said. And so Moses agreed to do that. Moses went up into that mountain and he's gone for 40 days. Now, that brings us to Exodus chapter 21. In my Bible, it's got some notes, and you might look when you're reading your Bible, sometime up at the top of the page or there at the chapters and so. What it says for chapters 21 through 23 in my Bible, in the little notes there, divers, laws, and ordinances. Now, you need to read those. It's not quite as exciting to read, but God is telling them how he wants that people to live. Some of it is just very practical things that they are to do. He's preparing them to live in the land of Canaan. And these are the laws that you're supposed to follow. Well, there's other things he did. After you get past 23 and you get over to chapter 25, here's what you're going to read. God is going to tell them how to worship him. He says, I want you to build me a tabernacle. This is a tent, a special tent. He told them about the rooms in the tent. It's going to have two rooms, a holy place and a very holy place, a most holy place, the Holy of Holies it is called. And then he told them the furniture to put into that tent. He told them the craftsmen to use to make sure they made it just this way. He told them about the priest, and there's going to be a priest, and they were to wear special robes, and there were certain sacrifices they were to make. And so he laid it all out to them and said, make sure you do all things according to this pattern. You can get a little dull or get a little lost sometimes reading all these instructions, but don't let that discourage you. Sometimes this is the place where people quit reading their Bibles. Don't do that. Read all of this. It's specific instructions, and everything in it has significance that we understand later, even though we may not understand it as we're reading through it this time. And I won't go into all of that tonight, but it all is going to have some significance later. Moses comes down with these instructions, and there's this sound down there in the camp. What is that? God is angry. He told them not to have any other gods before me. He told them not to make any graven image. And what did the people do? They made a golden calf and were worshiping a golden calf. And God was so angry, he told Moses, I'm going to destroy these people and start over with you. And Moses, I mean, just think about the power a man can have with God. Moses prayed and pled with God not to do that. And God told Moses he wouldn't do it. Now Moses goes down and then he sees what God sees. He is so upset. He takes those tablets of stone and he throws them down and breaks them. He marches down there among those people and he has to straighten them out and he disciplines them. And he has to go back up to the mountain another time now to receive that law. Moses comes back, and then here's what we're going to read. You read that they do what God said. All these instructions. Now this will be hard to do. You might want to get two Bibles. Go back and read the instructions, and then go over here in the other Bible and read right along with it and read what they did. You'll have a great lesson in obedience. Because it keeps saying as they do what they did according to the commandments of God, as God had commanded Moses. They keep doing it, and they build that temple, that tabernacle, the way Moses said. And then the book of Exodus comes to a close in Exodus 40, verse 34. Right at the end of it, it says, a cloud covered the tent of the congregation, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Now, we come to the book of Leviticus. Divers, laws, and ordinances. You're going to read a lot of that in the book of Leviticus. There's going to be a lot of instructions here about things. And there are different kinds of instructions. And again, don't get discouraged. Now's the time to just say, I'm going to be disciplined enough to read this, even though some of it's hard to grasp, some of it's a little bloody, as it talks about just what to do with all the animals and everything. Just be thankful we don't have to worship that way now. But he's going to tell them all this. Now, there's several kinds of instructions throughout these laws. You can have them in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. There's different kinds of instructions. Some of these are about how to worship God. And so he's telling them how he wants to be worshiped. Now, some of these are just about how to live a good, healthy life. They're going into the land of Canaan. He even says, if you do these things, I'll put on you none of the diseases that we put on the Egyptians. And a lot of it just has to do with good, wholesome, healthy living. And then some of it has to do with how you treat one another and how you treat your neighbor. You know, love the Lord thy God and love thy neighbor as thyself. That's all in there. And tells you how to treat each other right. Some of these are strange sounding instructions that why would the Lord say don't plow with an ox and and an ass together. And why would the Lord say, thou shalt not see the kid in his mother's milk? And different things that just seem kind of arbitrary. But remember now, they're going into the land of Canaan that had all these pagan practices. And some of these, if we understood all of the paganism they were about to face there and their idolatry, you'd see this is keeping them away from that idolatry. He's saying, don't do what they're doing over there. Now, you be different than that. And some of these instructions are very cultural in their nature, like the keeping of certain feasts, different times of year, having to come to the temple, to the tabernacle to offer your sacrifices, and then it has to do with the diet that you have, certain foods to eat and not to eat. Why would he say all that? Well, some part of the reason is it gives this nation an identity. There's going to be customs and things associated with the nation of Israel that are not like the nations around about them. And they would be a different people because he wanted to keep them separate from those nations. Now, there's not a lot of history in the book of Leviticus, but there's one story you need to watch. The story about Nadab and Abihu. Because after God had told them what to do, Nadab and Abihu had a better idea. They're going to do things their way. They did things that the Lord had not commanded. They used unauthorized fire. And the fire came out and consumed them. One of the great lessons of the book of Leviticus is, look, when God says something, he means that. And we don't presume upon God. We take his word with reverence and godly fear. God has spoken. And so we learn that valuable lesson going through the book of Leviticus. There's other historical events in there, but I want to move on into the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers is about them wandering through the wilderness going to the land of Canaan. Why did they have to wander around in the wilderness? Why didn't they just go to the land of Canaan? Well, they did. They walked right up to the borders of Canaan, direct. And Moses sent spies into the land, one from each tribe. And the spies came back and they said, this is a beautiful land. But let me tell you something. They've got walled cities. And they are like giant. We felt like grasshoppers among those giants. And the 10 said, we can't do this. And 2, Joshua and Caleb said, no, the Lord has said we can take this land, we can do it. And you know, Israel, that nation, was angry at the 2 and followed the fears of the 10. And the Lord was not happy with that. They had been gone for 40 days and 40 nights. And here they act this way. God said, for every day they're gone, you're going to wander in this wilderness until this generation is dead. And so that's what happened. And you read in the book of Numbers several events that happened, and we just can't go into all that. You've got to read the story. But you read about their wandering in the wilderness, and there's other laws and ordinances given all along the way, teaching them how to do, until that generation died. It was only the young that came out of the land of Egypt, under 20, that made it all the way to the promised land, except for those 2, Joshua and Caleb. And they come up to the borders of the land. Now, Moses is there. It had taken 40 years. Can you add that up? 40 years growing up in the palace of Pharaoh. 40 years as a shepherd on the backside of the wilderness. And then for 40 years, he led this grumbling, mumbling, rebellious bunch of folks through the wilderness until they were dead. And now he's arrived at the borders of the promised land. And we come to the book of Deuteronomy. He's the old man. This is a new generation. And in the book of Deuteronomy, this man said that I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Gave 5 sermons. It's one of the most eloquent books of the old Bible. You'll go through it. He's going to review with them in those 5. He's going to review their history. He's going to tell them about God and where they came from. He's going to go over the laws. Look, he gave us these laws. Let me go over these with you. And he goes over those laws. Deuteronomy means a second giving of the law. He goes over those laws, and all through this book, the emphasis is, look, you need to do what the Lord said. You need to be obedient to the Lord. He's going to bless you if you will obey Him. Now, if you rebel against Him, if you turn from Him, He is going to curse you. So let Him bless you. I set before you life and death. Choose life. And choosing life is following. Just imagine that. An old man, 120 years old. But let me tell you something about that old man. He was as strong as he was in his youth. His strength was not abated. Mentally, he was strong. And so you have this old man that had led them all these years going over that law and preaching to them and teaching them about that law till we come to the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And it says in the last chapter, Deuteronomy 34, verse 1, Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah that is over against Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land. He walked up there by himself, up on top of this mountain. Now we've got Moses and the Lord again, just like we had at the burning bush. Even Moses was not going to be able to go into the land. Part of that was because of Moses' mistakes that he had made. But Moses had done his work. And now he went up alone to be with God on that mountain. And God showed him what the land was going to be. And then in Deuteronomy 34, verses 4 through 6, the Lord said unto him, This is the land that I swear unto Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes. But thou shalt not go in thither. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab over against Beth Peor. No man knoweth his sepulchre unto this day. And then a little bit further down, Deuteronomy 34:10, and on to the end of the book now. And there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, and all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt to Pharaoh and all his servants and to all his land and all that mighty hand of all Israel. But Moses said something back in the book of Deuteronomy. You remember the promise God made to Abraham? Thou wilt have a son, and he had one. I'll make of thee a great nation, and he did that. I will give thee the land of Canaan. Now, he hadn't done that yet, but he showed Moses the land he's going to give. But do you remember that great promise that in thee shall all the nations of the earth be blessed? Now, Moses was of the seed of Abraham. But all the nations of the earth was not going to be blessed by Moses. He was of the tribe of Levi. You remember the promise Jacob had made? Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. The scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh come. Unto him shall the gathering of the peoples be. Judah, not Levi. It's not Moses. It never was Moses. And in the New Testament, some of the Jews had a hard time understanding this. They thought, well, what about Moses? It was never God's intent to bless all the nations of the earth with Moses and his law. Here's what Moses said, though. Back in Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15. The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee of thy brethren, like unto me. Unto him shall you hearken. You see, there was something else going to happen. It wasn't Moses. But God's going to keep that promise. The pieces are out there. He's putting the pieces in place. The next thing we're going to read about is when he gives them the land. He told Abraham he'd do that. We'll see that next Sunday night, Lord willing, when we look at Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And I hope to cover the high points of that chapter. But you see how this great drama is taking place? Doesn't that make you want to read that book? I love reading that story. And I know how it comes out. See, I know the end. Sometimes people say, oh, don't tell me how it's going to end, as though that would ruin the story. But this is a story where if you know how it ends, it makes the story better. Because that prophet comes as Jesus Christ. That's how all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. When he sends the gospel forth into all the world. And the blessings are going to come on those who will hear and believe and obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, the more you know how the story ends, the better the story is. Don't be like the Jews. And when they read the story, they didn't know how it ended, and they got all confused when they were reading and came up with the wrong idea. We know what the end is. And so now we know what to look for as we read forward. And it makes the story all the more glorious to me to know how it comes out. And so that's what's going to happen. They'll receive the land. We'll read about the history of the kings. It's all going to round up being fulfilled in Jesus Christ and the blessings that God said would be for all the world, all the families of the earth are for us. They're our blessings. And we can receive them. We will hear and believe and obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. That means we have to repent. We turn from our sins. We confess his name before men. We are baptized into Christ. And we rise to walk in newness of life. And all the spiritual blessings that God has promised down through all those ages become our own. Isn't that there is no more wonderful story than that. And so, as is our custom, I want to conclude this with an invitation. Make those spiritual blessings yours. Like we were studying this morning, all things are ready. Come to the feast. Don't make light of it and go your way. Come to this feast. Enjoy this spiritual bounty that is available for all those who will come to God through Christ. And with that, I extend the invitation as we stand and sing.